33-year-old Barbara Mendez looked down at the blank piece of paper in front of her. Rolling the pen under her fingers across the kitchen table, Barbara wished that writing or talking about her feelings was as easy for her as it was to make a delicious dinner or to embroider a piece of clothing or fine cloth. But it was coming up on Valentine's Day, 1982, and Barbara had decided that this year she was going to give her two daughters not just cards and chocolates, but a letter that told them how much she loved them. Both the girls were at or close to the point where they were becoming teenagers. Dawn was 13 and Christy was 11. And more, Barbara could feel them beginning to pull away from their parents. Not that the girls had ever given Barbara or her husband Robin, known to everyone by his nickname Bob, any trouble, and the pulling away that Barb sensed now was not rebellious or painful. The girls were just growing up, and Barb knew from her own childhood, and now her perspective as a mom, that the time all of them were spending together now in their modest but cozy house tucked away among the woods would not last forever. Taking a deep breath, Barb stopped rolling the pen, she picked it up, she pressed the point carefully onto the paper, and she began to write. She opened with, "My daughters." 5 sentences later, and Barb was finished. Relaxing her grip on the pen, she read over what she had written. Then she put her pen down, she folded the letter, and slipped it into its envelope. But before getting up from the table and getting started on her to-do list of household, church, and work tasks that never seemed to end, Barb turned toward the window and looked out at the cold and snowy Wisconsin winter. She and Bob had lived in Minocqua, a town with 3,300 residents and only 3 traffic lights, ever since their marriage almost exactly 14 years ago on March 2nd, 1962. But even though it was so small, Minocqua was still bigger than the town where Barb had done most of her growing up. Not long after she'd been born, more than 200 miles to the south, in the bustling county seat of Manitowoc, Barb's parents had moved their family up to Boulder Junction, a tiny town of fewer than 500 people. Even if Barb's father, an aircraft mechanic who had served in the Navy during World War II, and her mother, who had stayed home to take care of Barb and her 3 sisters, had not been fairly conservative and religious people, Boulder Junction was so small that Barb might not even have heard about a lot of the cultural, political, and technological changes of the 1960s that started just a few years before Barb and Bob had gotten married. So, while other young couples in other parts of the country might be experimenting with sex, drugs, and rock and roll music, Barb and Bob had settled here in Minocqua, in their 3-bedroom house located just a half-mile away from sleepy Route 70 and the family-owned upholstery business where Bob worked. And for Barb, who was quiet and shy, this life suited her just fine, because Barb had never really needed that much anyway to make her feel grateful and blessed. Staring now at the snow-covered pine trees outside, Barb thought ahead to the arrival of spring and summer, and how she and her girls had always made the most of those 2 magical seasons, going out together to pick the berries that Barb would make into jars of fruit jellies and preserves, and enjoying the lakes that Minocqua was famous for in this part of the Northwoods. And always, as the girls got older, Barb had made a point of welcoming her daughter's friends for playdates and sleepovers, and doing everything she could to make sure that Minocqua felt less like a small town that people couldn't wait to leave, and more like the storybook version of Little House on the Prairie, where childhood was wholesome, fun, and safe. In fact, the biggest transformation in the social lives of Barb and Bob Mendez and their 2 kids had happened 3 years earlier. And it had nothing to do with popular culture and trends, and everything to do with the family's spiritual life. That was when Barb and Bob, along with a handful of other passionate believers in a conservative Christian denomination called Assemblies of God, had helped found a church of their own. Located about 8 miles west of the Mendez house, the new church had very quickly become the center of the family's social as well as spiritual life. Barb had become a Sunday school teacher, and Bob, who was more outgoing than his wife, was one of the church's youth group leaders. For all the Menendezes, church was where they formed their closest friendships. That's where Barb's older daughter, Dawn, could spend time with her best friend Jody, whose father was one of Bob's best friends. Barb's best friend was also a very active member of the church. Sherry Anderson, whose husband, Wendell, was the pastor, was as close to a confidant as the very private and reserved Barb Mendez had. It had been with Sherry's support and encouragement that Barb had picked up a part-time job starting about a year ago, working as a teller at the Park City Credit Union, which was located roughly halfway between the Mendez home and the Assemblies of God church. And suddenly, with that job, everything Barb could have wanted was within a 10-mile radius of where she sat right now. The church where she worshipped, the bank where she worked, and the family business where Bob worked installing carpets and upholstery. Every member of her family had become well known in this community. Bob out riding his motorcycle to work with his toolkit strapped on the back, the girls going off to school each day, and Barb herself, whose friendly manner and shy but beautiful smile had made her a favorite among the members of Park City Credit Union. But right now, as Barb continued to stare out the window of her kitchen, the Valentine's Day letter in its envelope on the table in front of her, she wondered exactly when and how her life seemed to have slipped out of its perfect frame. There were the recent bank robberies in the area, practically unbelievable in a town that hadn't seen a murder since 1935 and very few violent crimes of any type, and Barb had to admit that even though only one of those robberies was still unsolved, she felt scared every time she saw a customer in the bank who behaved in any way that struck her as out of the ordinary. But Barb also knew that her real trouble lay much closer to home. In fact, she worried that it lay right inside one of her favorite places on earth, the Assemblies of God Church. And lately, when she entered the worship area that meant so much to her and that had been her place of comfort and strength, Barb was now finding excuses to slip away so she could sit by herself in one of the meeting rooms, doing her best to hold back tears. 2.5 months later, on Wednesday, April 28, 1982, Barb packed the family car in the lot right behind the Park City Credit Union, located on Highway 51 in the city of Minocqua. It was a clear, sunny day, cold in the morning, but by afternoon, the temperature was supposed to double. As Barb closed the driver's side door of the car and headed for the bank, she was glad that after the long Wisconsin winter, it was finally starting to warm up. But despite the spring weather and sunshine, when Barb walked inside into the work area of the credit union, she had to force herself to smile as she said good morning to her boss, credit union manager Helen Gray. Because the last 2 days had been hard for Barbara. 2 days earlier, on Monday the 26th, there had been an embarrassing incident at the Bible study meeting that Barb and Bob had gone to at a church member's home. And on the very next day, Tuesday, April 27th, Barb had a long phone conversation with her friend Sherry, the church pastor's wife. Barb could not bring herself to tell Sherry the real secret that weighed so heavily on Barb these days, but Barb did manage to reassure her friend that soon Barb would be taking steps to resolve the problem, and when that was done, Barb would be feeling much better. After ending that phone call, Barb had turned her attention to making dinner. But even though the Mexican food Barb had prepared, Bob's favorite, had gotten rave reviews, the evening had left Barb feeling tired, and she was still tired this morning as she counted the bills in her drawer and took her position behind the customer service counter. Then, as Helen walked across the lobby to open the bank doors for business, Barb gave herself a mental shake. Making sure her white blouse was neatly tucked into her dark skirt, Barb squared her shoulders as the first customer stepped up to her station. But by midday, Barb's workload had unexpectedly doubled. Helen, the bank manager, had started to feel sick, and by 1 p.m., she felt so bad that she and Barb had decided that Helen should just go home and let Barb finish out the day and close the bank on her own. About 4 hours after Helen had left, Barb was helping the last customer of the day, one of the members of the credit union's own board of directors, who was there to convert $55 in change into dollar bills. Even if Barb hadn't been alone for half of her shift, that Wednesday still would have felt like an unusually stressful day. Because that afternoon, Barb had had a scary interaction with a customer named Thomas Bowes, who kicked up a fuss when she told him that because he wasn't a member of the credit union, she could not cash the check he had handed to her. When he came back a second time after filling out a membership card and Barb did cash the check, his irritability and the argument he got into with his brother, who was with him, made Barb wish she was not alone behind the counter. All she'd been able to think about were the 2 recent bank robberies in the area and the fact that the suspect in one of those robberies was still on the loose. Chatting now about that encounter with the credit union board member, Barb relaxed a little as she rolled the last of the coins into its paper sleeve, handed over the dollar bills in exchange, and then walked her final customer to the door. As she watched the man cross the parking lot and get into his car and wave back at her, Barb felt a rush of relief that it was finally 5 o'clock and her workday was almost over. and after locking the door behind her, Barb headed back to the office to start entering that day's transactions into the balance sheet. But Barb hardly had time to sit down, catch her breath, and pull up the credit union balance sheet to make her first few entries when she heard a knock on the front door of the building. Startled, Barb dropped her pencil and looked up. But the entrance to the bank wasn't visible from the desk where she was sitting, and the only way to see who was there knocking was to get up and walk past the service counter and out into the lobby and waiting area. Barb looked at the time. The bank had been closed for almost 15 minutes, but even as Barb was deciding whether she should go to the door and see who it was, or, still thinking about the recent bank robberies, call the police, she heard the knock again. And this time, she thought she could make out a voice she recognized. Taking her hand away from the telephone on her desk, Barb waited a few seconds for her heart to stop racing. Then the 33-year-old wife and mother of two stood up, made a wide loop around the counter, and headed for the front door. A little over 2.5 hours later, at close to 8 p.m. that night, the first police and emergency medical vehicles were pulling up in the parking lot outside the City Park Credit Union, sirens on and lights flashing. There to meet them was the credit union manager, Helen Gray, who had placed the 911 call to the Minocqua Police Department a few minutes earlier at 7:43 p.m. Still in a state of shock, Helen walked into the credit union with police officer Norm McMahon and led him behind the service counter to a space between one of the staff desks and the bank safe located behind the desk and against the side wall of the bank. Sprawled inside of that space, police found the brutally beaten body of Barbara Mendez. And even as Helen and the police officer stepped back to let medical technicians check for signs of life, it was clear that Barbara was dead. Her wavy shoulder-length brown hair was matted with blood, and the left side of her skull, face, and ear showed cuts and drag marks from whatever weapon had been used to kill her. From the position of her body, it looked like Barb's attacker had struck her from behind, and at some point during or after the attack, the murderer had rolled her body over so she was lying across her left arm, while her right arm, the fingers curled upward in a loose fist, was stretched out along her right side. Blood from Barbara's injuries had spread out in a wide pool around her head, too much to be fully absorbed by the thick carpet underneath her. The cash drawer at the counter where Barb had worked that day was open, and a total of what would turn out to be $2,700 was missing. The Minocqua Police Department may not have investigated a homicide in almost 50 years, but Officer McMahon's training kicked in right away. After giving directions to secure the crime scene and get crime scene techs to the bank as soon as possible, one of Officer McMahon's first calls was to Barbara's husband, Bob. It had been Bob who had called the manager of the credit union earlier that evening at 7:15 after Barb had failed to show up at church for the 7 p.m. Wednesday service. Even though Barb had called him earlier that day to say that she would be working late, she had also told Bob that she'd be home in time to pick up the girls and join him at church for the 7 p.m. service. Figuring that Helen's home was closer to the bank than the church was, Bob had asked the manager of the credit union if she would make the 1.5-mile trip to Park City Credit Union to check on Barb. Already feeling guilty that she had left Barb alone to close up the bank that evening, Helen immediately hopped into her car with her daughter and did what Bob asked her to do. And just 27 minutes later, Helen had made her gruesome discovery, and with shaking hands, she had dialed 911. But even as police were setting up a perimeter of yellow crime scene tape around the bank and arranging for Bob to identify his wife's body, investigators from both the Minocqua Police Department and the Oneida County Sheriff's Department, which had also responded to the emergency call, had already put together two possible theories that would explain the crime scene and Barb's murder. The first theory was that Barb had been the tragic victim of a bank robbery gone wrong. That theory fit neatly with the fact that there had been a recent rash of robberies in the area, that the perpetrator in one of the robberies was still at large, and that approximately $2,700 was missing from Barb's cash drawer. The second theory was that the motive for the murder was personal, and that Barb's attacker had made off with the money so it would look like a robbery. This theory, that Barbara knew her attacker, would explain why there was no sign of forced entry into the credit union, why the assailant had not taken any of the $17,000 in cash that was sitting in plain sight inside the open safe just a few feet away from Barb's body, and why Barb's attacker was apparently able to walk right up behind her and strike her on the back of the head. Over the next 2 months, officers from the Minocqua and nearby Rhinelander police departments, along with the deputies from the sheriff's department, had a total of 10 investigators working more than 12 hours a day on the Barbara Mendez homicide. With other officers also donating their off-duty time to help, law enforcement would interview more than 100 witnesses, as well as follow up on a barrage of tips and rumors. They had questioned people who had transacted business at the credit union that day, as well as shoppers and store owners at the business center near the bank. They had combed the wooded areas along Highway 51 where the credit union was located, looking for a murder weapon they did not find, and they had collected as much physical evidence from the crime scene as possible without coming up with any blood samples or fingerprints that would lead them to a possible killer. But despite the hours that law enforcement had poured into this investigation, by mid-May, 6 weeks after Barb's death, police investigating both theories of the crime had hit one dead end after another. As the husband of the victim, Bob Mendez was automatically at the top of the suspect list. But Bob was also among the first suspects that police had to cross off their list. From the time Bob arrived home from work at Lakeland Upholstery at about 5 p.m. until sometime after 8 p.m. when he arrived at the Park City Credit Union, Bob could account for all his actions and whereabouts. Bob's alibi was confirmed 3 days later when they followed up their initial interviews with Bob and Barb's daughters, Dawn and Christy, with long interviews at the police station where they took down the family members' formal statements. Both Dawn and Christy, who had gotten home from school on the day of their mother's murder at about 4:20 p.m., had seen their dad come home about a half hour later, just before 5 p.m. Just after 5, their dad had passed along a phone message from their mom telling them she'd be home by 6:15 or 6:30. And since Dad would be riding his motorcycle to church that evening, Barb would drive the girls to the 7 p.m. service with her. After that phone call, Bob and the girls had a quick dinner of tacos. Dawn's best friend Jody had also spoken to Bob around 5:15 or 5:30 when she telephoned the Mendez house, and Bob had answered the phone. After that, Bob had showered, dressed, and then hopped on his 1979 Honda CX-5000 motorcycle and left for church, where church members would see him at about 6:20 p.m. But aside from confirming that Bob did not leave the church again until he got the call from police that Barb was dead, members of the Assemblies of God Church just did not seem that eager to share information about each other's lives and church politics or gossip with police. And Barb's funeral service, which was held on the same day that Christy, Dawn, and Bob were all formally interviewed, did not offer any clues about Barb's personal life either. As a few police officers watched from their seats in the back of the church, 300 mourners filled into the sanctuary of the Assemblies of God on Town Line Road. Pastor Wendell Anderson described Barb as, quote, a woman who had committed her life to the Lord, end quote, before reading some of Barb's favorite verses from the Bible. The next day, the local newspaper would quote one of Barb's friends and fellow church members as saying that Barbara's death, quote, did not fit her life in any way, end quote. And then, this friend summed up the fear that had gripped the entire town of Minocqua in the wake of Barb's murder, the first homicide the sleepy town had seen since 1935. Quote, it's all just horrible, end quote. Meanwhile, as the Minocqua Police Department started focusing its efforts on finding suspects who may have had a personal motive for killing Barb, the Oneida County Sheriff's Department was focusing more and more on the theory that Barb was a victim of a robbery gone wrong. And for them, suspect number 1 was Thomas Bowes, the argumentative man who had visited the Park City Credit Union 2 times on April 28th, the day of Barb's murder. Because, as police soon discovered, Thomas had a prior criminal conviction from 5 years earlier for committing a robbery without a weapon. And when Thomas Bowes' wife, Judith, started changing her story about her husband's activities and whereabouts on the day of Barb's murder, Police zeroed in on the man at least one officer privately described as more of a, quote, goof than a danger to society. But, like all the other leads police had uncovered in the case, the Thomas Bowes lead would dry up 9 months after Barb's murder in the end of January 1983, when Thomas passed a lie detector test. And meanwhile, other leads involving other robbery suspects would also hit a dead end. But by the fall of 1982, 3 months before Thomas Bowes was crossed off the suspect list, residents of Minocqua were all talking about a different crime that had just been reported in their local newspapers. And like Barb's death, this crime also involved a member of the Assemblies of God Church on Township Road, the same church that Bob and Barb had helped found 3 years earlier. In October 1982, 6 months after Barb's murder, the church was rocked by an allegation that one of its members had been sexually assaulting a 14-year-old girl. The charge resulted in the perpetrator being sentenced to 4 years of probation, but the scandal also had the effect of breathing new life into the stalled investigation into Barb's murder. Law enforcement had no evidence that linked the two crimes, but officers decided to take another run at interviewing church members about what might have been going on in the church at or around the time that Barb was killed. They also re-interviewed Bob. Barb's husband had raised eyebrows when he'd started dating a new girlfriend earlier that fall, but when police re-interviewed him in October, nothing about his alibi or about the statements his daughters had made to police 6 months earlier had changed at all. And by the spring of 1984, 2 years after Barb had been murdered, the investigation into her death once more stuttered to a halt, and the key players in the drama were all starting to move on with their lives. On March 10th of 1984, Bob had remarried and his new wife had moved into the Mendez house, where she would do her best to fill the terrible hole that Barb's death 2 years earlier had left in the lives of Barb and Bob's daughters, Dawn and Christy. Meanwhile, the sex abuse scandal at the Assemblies of God Church would fade from the headlines. The $5,500 reward for information leading to a conviction in the murder case of Barb Mendez would go unclaimed, and contributions to an educational fund for Dawn and Christy would slow to a trickle. The only other progress in the investigation would be DNA tests that cleared rather than convicted one remaining suspect in the rash of robberies that had occurred near the time of Barb's death, along with a visit to the police from a Minocqua resident who dropped off a particular tool that they thought might match the type of weapon that had been used to beat Barbara Mendez to death. So this tool that was dropped off was an example of what the murder weapon could have been, not the actual murder weapon. Investigators established the Minocqua resident's alibi, they took a picture of the tool, made a note, and filed the information away inside a case file that now included thousands of pages. And if it hadn't been for the sheer persistence and determination of Barbara's own daughters, that huge case file might never have been opened again. Because, in the course of getting on with their own adult lives, both Christy and Dawn had joined forces and become determined not to rest until they had discovered who had killed their mother. Starting back in 2002, 20 years after Barbara was murdered, Dawn, now 33 years old, and Christy, now 31 years old, began a relentless campaign aimed at getting police to reopen the investigation into their mother's death. That included writing a letter in 2016 to the producers of the true crime television show titled Cold Justice, asking them to take a look into the unsolved murder of their mother. And in February of 2017, the two women finally got the response they had been pleading for. 35 years after Barb's murder, and almost a year after dropping that letter off in the mail, the Cold Justice team of investigators accepted the challenge. And 1 year after that, police, with the help of the investigators from Cold Justice, finally closed in on a murderer who had eluded them for more than 3 decades. When the arrest came on February 6, 2018, nearly 36 years after Dawn and Christy first learned that their mother was dead, it was the result of an intense 2-week-long partnership between Cold Justice and the Oneida County Sheriff's Office. During those 2 weeks, the team of investigators reviewed the entire case file on the murder of Barbara Mendez from beginning to end. And after hiring a forensic weapons expert to help identify what instrument was used to kill Barb, and talking again with 3 key witnesses, as well as Barb's old church friend Sherry Anderson, wife of church pastor Wendell Anderson, police uncovered the truth about one of the most infamous murders that has ever occurred in the Northwoods of Wisconsin. Based on that investigation, here is a reconstruction of what happened to Barbara Mendez on April 28, 1982. By the time 33-year-old Barbara Mendez had closed and locked the door of the Park City Credit Union on that Wednesday evening in late April, she was physically and emotionally exhausted. She'd been thinking over the events of the last several days and about the concerns she had shared with her friend Sherry when they talked by phone just the night before. But Barbara had not told Sherry everything, and even now, knowing what Barb did, Barb wasn't sure that Sherry or anyone else at the church would really be able to understand the decision that Barb felt like she had to make. Walking back to her desk, Barb sat down and started making her first entries into that day's bank transaction record. The quicker she could get this done, the sooner she would be home with her 2 daughters, and the sooner they would all be at the 7 p.m. church service where Barb could talk again to her friend Sherry. 10 minutes later, the sudden and unexpected knock on the front door of the bank made Barb jump. Her first thought was that it might be a bank robber, and Barb felt her heart start to hammer in her chest. But as soon as Barb heard the voice that was calling to her from outside the bank, she stopped reaching for the phone to call police. This was a voice that Barb recognized, and this was a conversation that Barb knew she could no longer avoid having. Taking a deep breath, Barb pushed her chair back, stood up, and began walking towards the door. For Barb's killer, as well as for Barb, this was a moment of decision. And standing now in the shadow of the entryway to the credit union, the killer listened first to the silence inside, and then to the sound of footsteps, and then to the key turning in the lock. A moment later, and the killer was inside. The killer reached out a hand, but Barb moved away. Turning, she walked back over to her desk. She had read the Bible. She knew what the scriptures had to say about the kind of relationship she had observed and the kind of person who got involved in that sort of relationship. Their conversation did not last long. The killer had denied everything, but Barb had spent weeks watching and listening, and Barb could no longer stand by and let this relationship go on. The killer stood in front of her and bowed their head. Barb reached down and picked up the bills she had collected out of the cash drawers. Signaling that the visit was now over, Barb turned her back and took 3 steps in the direction of the open safe. All she wanted now was to end this encounter, to finish her work, and to get home to her kids. But the killer could not let that happen. As soon as Barb had turned toward the safe, the killer reached into their coat pocket to pull out the metal pry bar they had hidden there. The flat end of the tool fit comfortably in their hand. At the other end of the shaft, the claw tip bent at an angle, giving the tool the same overall shape as a short flat crowbar with flat, sharp, beveled ends. Quietly, the killer took a single long step toward Barb's back. Once they were just within striking distance, the killer raised the pry bar high over their left shoulder and then brought it down with terrible force against the back left side of Barb's skull. Once Barb had collapsed to the floor, the killer stepped over to her body. Grabbing her right arm, the killer rolled Barb onto her side so her left arm was stretched underneath her chest. Tightening their grip on the pry bar, the killer bent down and began beating Barb's head and the left side of her face, dragging the curved end of the bar again and again through her hair and skin, making ragged cuts and scratches across her cheek and tearing away part of her left ear. The autopsy that would be performed on Barb's body the next day, Thursday, April 29th, would catalog a total of at least 17 blows to Barbara's head, all resulting in extensive skull fractures. The total absence of any defensive wounds suggested that the attack took Barb completely by surprise, and the first blow was so disabling that Barb never even had a chance to fight back or protect herself in any way. Now, looking down at Barb's body, the killer rested their palms against their knees. The pry bar in the fingers of one hand glistened red in the single overhead light. Waiting to catch their breath, the killer watched as the pool of blood under Barb's head widened across the carpet. And then, standing up, the killer set about making the murder look like the scene of a robbery gone wrong. In a few fast movements, the killer had grabbed a deposit bag from Barbara's desk that contained about $2,700 in that day's transactions, leaving Barbara's cash drawer behind the service counter open and empty. Pausing just long enough to make sure they were not leaving anything behind that could reveal their identity, the killer walked to the front entrance with the pry bar and bag of cash, and then, making sure not to leave any fingerprints, the killer slipped out of the Park City Credit Union. Glancing at their watch, the killer was surprised to find that the entire encounter with Barb, ending with her death, had taken fewer than 10 minutes. Still, it was the critical window of time, part of maybe 30 minutes that police would come up with as the time the murder was committed, and the killer knew they had to find a way to place themselves during this half-hour period far away from the credit union. But the killer wasn't worried. After all, teenagers did not really pay very close attention to what time it was, and the killer knew it would be easy to manipulate and coach the people closest to him into providing him with the perfect alibi. A few minutes later, just after 5:30 p.m., Bob Mendez, Barbara's husband and killer, arrived back at the family home on Hill North Dale Road. The bloody pry bar that he had just used 15 minutes earlier to murder his wife was securely locked in the toolbox on the back of his Honda CX-5000 motorcycle. And by the morning of May 1st, 3 days after Barb's death, the most important pieces of Bob's plan to cover up for his crime fell neatly into place. When investigators brought Bob and his 2 daughters down to the police station that morning to give their formal statements about where they were and what they were doing on the evening that Barbara was murdered, the only times that the 2 devastated teenagers could seem to remember about exactly where their father was between 4:55 and 6:45 on the night of their mother's murder were the times that their father had told them. Yes, Dawn and Christy told investigators, their father had been home before 5 p.m. Yes, he had stayed at the house until close to 6 p.m., when he had left on his motorcycle to drive to church. And Bob still had one more important witness that he could also count on for helping him create a watertight alibi. And that person was his daughter Dawn's best friend, 14-year-old Jody, the teenager that Bob had been sexually abusing for almost an entire year, the teenager that Bob had promised to marry as soon as he could end his marriage to Barb. It would turn out that Robin Bob Mendez was not at all the good Christian and the fine husband and devoted father he pretended to be. And by February of 1982, when his wife, Barb Mendez, sat down to write a Valentine's Day letter to her 2 daughters, Barb had already begun to put together the true picture of who her husband was. Not only did Barb know that her marriage was in trouble, she had also begun to suspect that her husband was involved in an inappropriate relationship with a girl who was just barely 14 years old. And not only was this girl close friends with their own daughters, Jody was also the daughter of Bob's own best friend, as well as a member of Bob's youth group at the Assemblies of God Church on Township Road. By the spring of 1982, rumors and whispers had begun to swirl inside the church about the amount of time and attention that Bob was lavishing on Jody. And members also noticed that Bob and Barb Mendez no longer sat together at church services, and on one occasion, they had arrived in separate cars at a Bible study meeting at a member's home, with Barb looking and acting so visibly upset that everyone in the group had felt extremely uncomfortable and embarrassed. By late April, Barb had begun to confide to her friend Sherry that she was worried about the relationship between Bob and Jody, and that Barb had decided she needed to confront her husband. If he did not stop all contact with Jody and start working on his marriage, Barb had decided she was going to take her daughters and leave Bob and go stay with her own parents, who now lived out in Colorado. But Barb never had the chance to put that plan into effect and to help rescue a vulnerable teenage girl from an abusive relationship with Barb's husband. Instead, on April 28th, Bob, the only person aside from the bank manager who knew Barb would be closing the credit union alone that evening, showed up after finishing his work at Lakeland Upholstery at the Park City Credit Union. Armed with the pry bar he used almost every day and carried with him in his toolbox, Bob knocked on the locked door of the bank and called out to Barb, telling her that he needed and wanted to talk. And just a few minutes after opening the door to Bob, Barb had been beaten to death by her husband of 14 years. After Barb's murder, Jody, who had also been coached and manipulated by Bob, joined with his daughters in giving him a fake alibi. It wouldn't be until 6 months later, when police investigated allegations that Bob was sexually abusing Jody, that Jody broke down and told police that she had been lying when she said that she had talked to Bob on the Mendez house phone at about 5 p.m. on the night that Barb was killed. But laws and public perception regarding sexual abuse were a lot different in 1982 than they are today, and police were skeptical about Jody's corrected testimony. And even though Bob pled no contest to the charges and was convicted of sexual assault on a minor, he was only sentenced to 3 years of probation. Meanwhile, 14-year-old Jody was savaged in the press and by her own father for being a temptress and a slut and an adulterer. But even though Bob's now public relationship with Jody gave him a motive for wanting his wife Barb dead, he still had the perfect alibi, the one provided by his deeply traumatized daughters, Christy and Dawn. It wasn't until 2002, when the daughters were in their early 30s and started looking back over their childhood, and in particular their father's behavior after their mother was murdered, that they began to realize how obviously and completely they had been coached, manipulated, brainwashed, and used by their own father, the man who never even purchased a headstone for his dead wife and who never once took his kids to see her grave. The man who had been seen by 2 different witnesses leaving the credit union on his motorcycle during the window of time in which the murder was committed. The man who suddenly had enough cash right after that murder to buy himself an expensive new motorcycle and who painted his motorcycle helmet a different color. The man who failed a lie detector test 5 weeks after the murder of his wife. The man who not only sexually assaulted their own good friend Jody, but who would later go to prison for 8 years for sexually abusing a 5-year-old girl, and the man whose own brother would go to the Oneida County Sheriff's Department in 2002 and suggest that the murder weapon they were looking for might be a pry bar, one of the tools that his brother, Bob Mendez, used so often at work that Bob took it with him everywhere in his portable toolkit. But it wouldn't be until 2017, when investigators from the TV series Cold Justice teamed up with the Oneida County Sheriff's Department, that law enforcement was finally able to break Bob Mendez's perfect alibi. Not only did they now have the testimony of Bob's own daughters that the alibi was fabricated, they were also able to track down and interview Jody, the survivor of Bob's sexual abuse. Now a successful adult in a happy marriage, Jody had gone on to work in law enforcement and to be a voice for other victims of crime and abuse. And this time, investigators believed her testimony that she had not spoken to Bob at his home during the critical window of time when police believed Barb had been murdered. On February 6, 2018, Robin Bob Mendez was arrested in the parking lot of a Minocqua Walmart store and charged with the first-degree murder of his wife, Barbara Mendez. On July 23, 2019, Bob Mendez was sentenced to life in prison. Because he was sentenced under guidelines in force at the time of the crime, 1982, he will be eligible for parole in 2039 at the age of 91. Included in the documents that Dawn and Christy had sent to the producers of Cold Justice when they asked the show's investigators to take on the unsolved murder of their mother was the Valentine's Day letter that Barbara had written to her daughters 35 years earlier. Barb's friends and family now believe that by mid-February 1982, 6 weeks before Barb was bludgeoned to death by her husband, Barb had begun to suspect Bob of sexual abuse, and that Barb herself may have felt that dark events were about to unfold in their lives. This is the Valentine's Day message that Barb wrote to 11-year-old Christy and 13-year-old Dawn with all of that in mind. My daughters. Sometimes mothers don't always take the time to tell their daughters just how much they are loved and appreciated. Our lives can go by so fast and we will have missed so much together. So, on this Valentine's Day, I want to tell you how much I love you. You are so special to me as daughters. Have a nice Valentine's Day and every day. I love you, your mother. In 1996, 21-year-old Katie Fleming was studying French at the University of Oregon. That summer, she was invited to go on a camping trip with some very close friends and some people she had not met before. Their destination was this beautiful spot along the Sierra Nevada mountain range in California, but as soon as they got there, Katie did not take in any of the beautiful scenery. Instead, she fixated solely on 25-year-old James Kim, who was one of those people she had not met before that was going on this trip. And for the people that were on this trip, they would say James and Katie immediately just fell in love with each other. And for the duration of this trip, they were inseparable. And then when they got back from this trip, James would actually move from Seattle to Oregon to be with Katie. And then after Katie graduated from college, the two got married in Las Vegas and then settled in San Francisco. James, who loved technology and always had, was quickly hired by a tech company to try out new technology and then write a review for the average consumer. Basically, James got paid to play with toys, and so he loved his job. The couple also opened 2 boutique stores in San Francisco. One was an apothecary and the other sold eccentric clothing, and those 2 shops were managed by Katie full-time. By 2006, the Kim family had become very successful financially and they had grown in size. They had a 4-year-old daughter named Penelope and a 7-month-old daughter named Sabine. Katie and James both adored their kids, but James especially was known for blowing off virtually everything and anyone to be with his daughters. In fact, his friends and family would say you couldn't even have a conversation with James if his daughters were in the room, because James would get distracted and just stare at his daughters and then would eventually just leave mid-conversation to go play with them. James was also known to bring his daughters to work virtually every chance he got, even if it really wasn't allowed at this company. On Friday, November 17th, James, Katie, and their 2 daughters loaded up into their station wagon and then drove north to Seattle. They planned on spending Thanksgiving with James's aunt and uncle who lived in the city. And also, James and Katie were considering leaving San Francisco and moving elsewhere, and Seattle seemed like a natural landing spot for them. So this trip served nicely as a chance to see family and to explore the area. And so late on Friday night, after a very long trip, they finally arrive in Seattle, and for the next couple of days, they have a wonderful time visiting with family and having Thanksgiving dinner. On Friday, November 24th, so a day after Thanksgiving, James, Katie, and their daughters loaded back up into the station wagon early in the morning. They said bye to James's aunt and uncle, and then they hit the road. But instead of just driving straight all the way to San Francisco, which would have taken the entire day and then some, they decided to make a stop in Portland, Oregon, where one of Katie's very close friends from college was going to meet them for lunch. And so after about 3.5–4 hours, they arrive in Portland, they meet Katie's friend, and they have this nice lunch. And then afterwards, the family retired to a hotel where they crashed for the night. The next morning, the plan was originally to just get in the car and then drive all the way back to San Francisco. But Katie suggested to James that instead of just driving all day, why don't we just stay here for part of the day, leave in the afternoon, and we'll stop somewhere between here and home. We'll break up the drive one more time. James thought it was a great idea. They pulled out the map, and Katie found a nice family-friendly vacation spot that was almost exactly halfway between where they were and home. It was called the 22-Ton Lodge, and it was located on the coast of Oregon in a town called Gold Beach. And so James and Katie think, perfect, this is exactly what we needed. Katie calls the lodge, and she makes reservations for that night. And so that afternoon, after the family spent their nice day in Portland, they hopped in the car and they began traveling south towards the 22-Ton Lodge. At about 8:30 p.m., the family was still on the road making their way when James got really hungry and said, let's pull over and get a bite to eat. So the family pulls over at a Denny's restaurant in Central Oregon. They go inside, and then after a quick bite to eat, they get back out and they're on the road at 9 p.m. From the Denny's to the lodge was about a 2.5-hour drive. But after driving for 2 more hours, James realized they had missed a turn. So he told Katie about it, they looked at the map, and they realized if they were to backtrack all the way to that turn, it would add several more hours onto their trip. And so they began looking for an alternative path. And they found one. Instead of going all the way west to the coast and then all the way south to this lodge, which was the original plan, they could just go south from where they were all the way until they were parallel with this lodge. And then from there, they could just cut west along this road called Bear Camp Road that would basically go straight to their destination. But what this map did not do a good job of explaining was just how dangerous Bear Camp Road was. It started at 900 feet of elevation, but very quickly went all the way up to 4,000 feet feet of elevation before it went over the backside of this mountain down to Gold Beach and where this lodge was. While the road is paved, it's incredibly narrow and it's basically cut into a mountainside, and so there's very steep drop-offs throughout most of this ride, and there are no guardrails protecting people from falling off. The summer is really the only time people should be on Bear Camp Road because that's when the road is maintained. In the winter, the road is not plowed, it's not maintained, and so even a light snowstorm could make the road totally impassable. And the road cuts through a very remote section of Oregon where there's just not many people around. So if you get in trouble out there, you're probably on your own. But the Kims were not aware of the dangers this road possessed, and so after going south for a while, they did turn on to Bear Camp Road and began slowly driving up the mountain. And so as James is driving, Katie falls asleep in the passenger seat, the girls fall asleep in back, and outside it begins to snow. An hour later, Katie wakes up from her sleep, and the first thing she notices is outside, it is snowing so hard that James now has the windshield wipers on full blast, and still you could barely see out the front windshield. She looked at her husband, and he was hunched over, white-knuckling the steering wheel, looking intently out the window, and she says to him, what's going on? Should we stop? Should we turn around? And James, without even looking at her, says, yeah, honey, I do want to turn around, but the road is so narrow, we can't. And then he would tell his wife that earlier they had actually driven through a fork in the road where there was enough space to turn around, and so now he was just hopeful that there'd be another fork somewhere that would allow them to turn around. And so Katie was not excited about the idea, but she trusted James and said, okay, let's keep going. And so James just continues driving up this mountain pass, and you got to understand, they are driving on basically a cliff. On the left side, left of James, is just a sheer drop-off, and the road is totally slick from the snow. And so periodically, as James is driving, even though he's only going about 5 miles an hour, he would begin to slip and slide, and he's right on the edge of this cliff. And so it was a very, very stressful ride, and after several more miles of this, they were not reaching any turnaround. In fact, they would have to periodically stop on inclines, put up the emergency brake, and one of them would have to get out and clear branches and rocks out of this tiny little road to continue onward. And so finally, Katie says to James, you gotta stop, you gotta back out of here. That's our only choice right now. And so James put the car in reverse, and he opens his car door so he can look down at the edge of this cliff to make sure he doesn't accidentally veer off of it. And so very slowly, without even applying the gas, he began going in reverse, making sure he didn't go off the cliff. And for hours and hours they did this. This must have been so stressful. But finally, they make it to this fork in the road that James had seen much earlier, and they're able to make a decision. They had two paths they could take. They could turn around completely and drive nose out along the path they came in on all the way to the highway, but that was a very far drive, and they knew that road was treacherous and there was a cliff drop off, and it was really just as dangerous as what they had been on, and they really were not keen to be on that road considering the weather. Or they could turn left and go down the mountain on this path that was way wider than the paths they were on. It was like this huge road, and it looked like it went straight to the bottom of the mountain. And they're thinking, we don't know where this goes. The signage is not clear where this goes, but you got to figure if you're going lower in elevation, the weather will not be as bad. And maybe if you go down this road, there'll be houses, or there'll be a gas station, or there'll be something. But whatever it is, it's probably better than going that way or that way. And so James turned the car and began driving down this new road. Unfortunately, this was the worst choice they could have made. This road they were now on was this long, winding dead end that was used by loggers in the summer. Now, normally, this mistake by the Kim family would have been caught because there was supposed to be a big yellow gate that sat across this road just a little ways past this fork, blocking all traffic from proceeding any further. But vandals had recently come up and cut the lock on this gate, swung it open, and then locked it open. So the gate is completely off the road. And so as the Kims drove past where they normally would have been stopped, they didn't even see a gate. There was no gate anywhere, and so they just kept on driving. And from where this gate should have been, the road went from paved to dirt and full of potholes, and it narrowed considerably. The couple drove for 15 miles on this very tight, winding road that once again was on a cliffside until finally they reached another fork in the road where they could either go right or they could go straight, but there was no sign telling them which way led to what. And so James stopped the car right in the middle of this intersection, and he and Katie look at each other and they know they're in trouble. So they get their phones out and they try calling for help, but they have no service. And so as they're struggling to place calls, one of them realizes it's no longer snowing. It's actually raining, and a lot of the snow on the ground seems to be getting washed away. And so after not being able to place calls for several minutes, they decide, you know what, it's 2 in the morning, we're tired, let's sleep here, we'll leave the car running, it'll be nice and warm, and when we wake up in the morning, this rain will most likely have washed away the snow, and we can just drive out of here. And so the two are kind of relieved as they're saying this out loud, that this situation is not nearly as bad as it seems, we'll be just fine. And so Katie, James, their 2 daughters, they fall asleep with the car running, it's nice and warm, and when they wake up, Katie and James realize it's gotten much, much worse. At some point in the night after they fell asleep, the temperature must have dropped again, and that rain became very heavy snow. And so all the water on the ground froze, and then almost a foot of snow fell on top of it. They were stuck. But Katie and James, they didn't panic because they remembered when they first turned onto Bear Camp Road, they had seen a plow truck parked off of the side of the road. And so to them, that meant if it snowed along Bear Camp Road, it would get plowed. And so that day, the Kims just stayed inside of their car and they ate snacks and they read books and they kept the heater on and they waited to be rescued. But over the course of that entire day, nobody came down that road. No plows, no anybody. And Katie and James continuously tried their cell phones to try to punch out and get some help, but they never had any service. Also, Katie and James continuously honked the horn in case someone was in the area that might hear them, but no one ever came to their rescue. And so by the end of that Sunday night, Katie and James were really starting to get worried because they have a 4-year-old and a 7-month-old. They cannot be out here for very much longer. But they began to tell each other that, you know what, it's Sunday, maybe the plows don't come through on Sundays. Maybe they just don't work out here on Sundays. And so tomorrow, Monday, the plows will be out here, they'll come by and they will save us. Also, Katie and James began telling each other to reassure each other that, hey, tomorrow, Monday, that's the day we were supposed to be back in San Francisco. And so people are bound to notice our absence and they will report it to police and they will come out here and they will save us. So tomorrow we are going to get found. And so Katie and James, they put their 2 daughters in their car seats and James read them some bedtime stories and then the family fell asleep. The next day, Monday, the family did a lot of the same things they did the day before. They sat in their car, they kept spirits high, they tried to use their cell phones, which didn't work. They honked their horns to get people's attention. That didn't work. They tried to ration their food, and the whole time, they're keeping their eyes up each side of this road they're on in hopes a plow comes through. But all day long, no trucks, no plows, nothing comes down this road. Meanwhile, back in San Francisco, the family's absence was noticed by a family friend, but they didn't report it to police because they figured the Kim family had just decided to stay out a little bit longer and they would be back soon. By Monday night, Katie and James were officially terrified. They were almost out of fuel in their car. They were almost out of food. In fact, to compensate for their low amount of food, Katie had begun not only breastfeeding her 7-month-old, but also began breastfeeding her 4-year-old. Also, outside of their car, bears began kind of assembling and checking them out. And at first, Katie and James would scream and yell and try to scare them off, but the bears ultimately were not that fazed by them. They were not aggressive, but it meant the family did not feel comfortable getting out of their car. And so they're in this very claustrophobic situation where they are literally trapped inside of this small car where all the windows are covered with snow and they can't go anywhere, they can't call anyone, they're running out of their supplies. I mean, this is a terrifying situation to be in. Katie and James had been really strong to this point, but around this time, they began to act scared, and their kids picked up on it, and they started acting scared and fearful. And so the parents were trying their best to calm them down and tell them everything's going to be fine and they're going to get out of here soon. But in reality, Katie and James knew that if they didn't get found soon, they were probably going to die. The next day when they woke up, which was Tuesday, again, no cars or trucks came down either road. There was no plows. The snow just continued to pile up, and the food was running unbelievably low to the point where James actually left the car and went out looking for bear droppings because there's bears all over the place now, and he would pull the berries out of their droppings, and he and Katie began eating those. But after a while, they decided that was not a good idea because they might poison themselves. Their daughters, who the day before had been acting out of fear and anxiety, were now lethargic and quiet. And the parents' response to this was to start fighting with each other about whose fault this was was, when in reality, they were just totally scared about what might happen to them. Meanwhile, back in San Francisco, the family had still not been reported to police. And so that night, Tuesday night, the Kim family once again huddled up inside of their car. James read the kids' books, and then they all fell asleep. The next morning, Wednesday, they ran out of gas for their car. And so they had no way to heat themselves. And so James got the spare tire out of the back of the car, and he rounded up some magazines inside of the car, and he lit a fire for the family to stand around and try to warm up by. And it worked, but the fire very quickly died out, and they couldn't find any wood that wasn't soaking wet to put on it. And so before long, they did not have a fire. And so all day that day, James and Katie were desperately looking up the road in hopes that a car or truck would come through. They never did. James and Katie tried their cell phones repeatedly, but they never got service. They honked their horns and they screamed out for help, but nobody heard them. And so before long, it was dark again, and the family was huddled up inside of their now freezing car, and all they could hear outside was the sounds of bears marching around the area. And so I'm sure James and Katie thought to themselves, I wonder if we'll survive the night. Meanwhile, back in San Francisco, that family friend who had noticed the Kims were gone on Monday, she did go to the police on Wednesday afternoon and reported them missing. And so a search party was being organized that night, but of course the Kim family would have no way of knowing that. The next morning, Thursday, the Kim family woke up, they survived the night, but at this point, James and Katie are speaking openly about the real possibility that they all might die. In fact, Katie says to James, you have to promise me if our two kids die out here, you have to kill me too. And James said he would. At this point, Katie and James do not believe a truck or a car or anything is going to drive down this road and save them. They believe their only hope of being rescued is by sending a smoke signal up into the air that a pilot might see. So they pull off all four tires of their car, and then they pull everything out of the car that might burn, and they stack that on the tires, and that included Penelope's prized stuffed lamb. And then once they had their big pile, they lit it on fire, and fairly quickly, a large black billowing cloud of smoke was going straight up to the sky, and for a minute the Kim family was very optimistic that they were about to be found, that certainly someone was going to see the smoke and come find them. But unfortunately, the fire burned out very quickly, they couldn't light it again, and nobody flew overhead. And so before long, the family is once again huddled inside of their freezing cold car that night. There's bears walking around outside. They're basically out of food. Their kids aren't even crying anymore. They're just silent and cold and miserable. And as they're all shivering and trying to stay warm, James realizes he needs to do something drastic or his family's going to die. And so the next morning, Friday, when they get up, James tells Katie that he had been studying the map and there is a town about 4 miles east called Galice that he believes he can get to in about 2 hours. Katie immediately said, no, you cannot leave us. We need you here. There's probably a search party out there looking for us right now. We need to stay together so we can all be found. But James's instincts were telling him that no one was coming for them, or no one was going to actually find them in time. And so their only hope was if he ventured off and found help. And so Katie finally reluctantly agrees to let him go because he seemed really confident. And so at 7:45 a.m. that morning, James gave his two daughters a big hug and a kiss, told them he loved them and he would see them soon, and then he hugged his wife and said he loved her, and then he turned around and walked up the road out of sight. At the same time, unbeknownst to the Kim family, hundreds of searchers and helicopters are all over Bear Camp Road looking for them. 2 days later, on Sunday, December 3rd, so a week after the family had originally gotten stuck, a helicopter pilot that was part of the search effort was flying around Bear Camp Road when he noticed footprints in the snow below. When he started following these footprints, and eventually the footprints kind of disappeared under some trees, and then he couldn't pick them up again, and so without that much fuel left, he decided he would just backtrack and follow the footprints back to their origin. And so he retraced these footprints for quite a while until he came to a clearing, and in the middle of the clearing was a car, and next to the car was Katie waving an umbrella back and forth. The pilot immediately knew who he was looking at, but he didn't have enough fuel to actually land and pick her and her family up. And so instead, he just hovered down as low as he could, and he made good eye contact with her to reassure her that I see you and we're coming for you. And then he marked on the map where they were. He flew off to the search headquarters, and just minutes later, another helicopter was spun up. They flew to that same location, and they were able to land in that clearing. And as soon as the pilot got out, he saw Katie running up to him, carrying her two daughters, who looked like they were in pretty good shape. And she's crying tears of joy, and she's thanking him profusely. And then when she's right up in front of him, she says, are you here because of my husband? Did James tell you where we were? And the pilot looked visibly confused. Katie picked up on it, and she explained how just 2 days earlier, James had left to go to the town of Police to get help, and he still hadn't come back yet. And so at this point, the pilot understood what was happening, and so he looked down and he said, "No, ma'am, we still have not found James." Katie was devastated, and she cried as she and her daughters were loaded into the helicopter and airlifted out of the forest and brought to a hospital. There they would make full recoveries. Meanwhile, the search effort, which had been all over Bear Camp Road, was suddenly focused exclusively on the area around where their car was. And professional trackers were brought in to look for James's tracks, and they found them fairly quickly and began following them. James, after departing his family to go look for help, which must have been the most difficult decision he had ever made in his entire life. He loved his family more than anything, and he had to abandon them in the middle of the wilderness with no food, with no power, and he has no idea if he'll ever see them again. And so after leaving them behind, he walked 3 miles up the road they came in on, and then instead of just continuing on that road in the direction of Galice, he deviated and walked off the road. He actually went straight down one of the cliffs until he hit a river. And it's believed that maybe he saw the river from up on the road and thought that would be a faster way to get to Galice. But either way, he got down to the river, and as he walked, he would leave behind him little bits of torn clothing and torn paper to create a trail of where he was going, presumably so if he needed to, he could backtrack to his family. And so he gets down to this river, and for several miles he walks downstream. And then after being gone for at least 2 hours and not reaching the town of Galice, he must have realized he had either gone the wrong way, and that's why he had not hit the town, or he had miscalculated the distance, and that's why he had not hit the town. But either way, he did not turn around and go back to his family. Instead, he pressed on, believing he was their only hope. And so on he went, crossing over rivers, getting totally soaked in frigid water. He went up and down mountains all over these totally rugged areas in nothing but street clothes. He had sneakers, pants, and a jacket on. He had no food, he had no water, and he just kept on going until it was nightfall, and he had covered about 10 miles at this point, and he laid down and he went to sleep. And that night must have been absolutely horrible, as he thought about his family that was alone in the woods somewhere. He probably wondered if they were still alive. And the temperature was in the 30s, and again, he's just in street clothes. But he survives the night, and so the next morning, that Saturday, he gets up and he's right back at it, despite the fact that he was physically wrecked at this point. But for him, he didn't care. He was doing it for his family. And so all day he hiked in and out of freezing cold streams, up and down mountains, until finally he found himself at the bottom of this deep ravine next to a river where he just fell to his knees, fell forward, and died. He had literally just kept on going, looking for help for his family, until he eventually succumbed to hypothermia. James's body was located 2 days after his wife and his daughters were successfully rescued. It would turn out the town of Galice was not 4 miles away from the family's car. It was about 15 miles away, but that's from point A to point B on a map, like a straight line. But when you actually are hiking in the wilderness, you don't go in straight lines because there's mountains and there's rivers and there's things that get in the way. And so in order to get to Galice from where their car was, James would have had to travel 30 or 40 miles, zigging and zagging up over 4 different mountains. And so this was a suicide mission from the start. James ultimately covered 16 miles through some of the most treacherous terrain in the country, wearing nothing but his street clothes. The professional trackers that followed this 16-mile trail to his body, they called his journey superhuman. The helicopter pilot would later say he never would have found Katie and the girls had he not spotted those footprints first and then traced them all the way back to that clearing. And it would turn out those footprints were made by James after he left his family and walked off to get help. And so even though it cost him his life, James did ultimately save his family.